There we are. Thank you. Welcome to the Early Childhood Subcommittee meeting. Today we're going to be examining a handful of bills. We have a quorum of members present. I would ask that advocates who are online, some of you have really nice icons that tell us who you are. If you wouldn't mind, if you're some of you we know, almost everybody looks like somebody that I'm familiar with. If you feel like we don't know you very well and you want to put something next to your name to tell us which organization you represent or who you are representing, that'd be helpful but not required. You all can keep your cameras off unless we call on you. A member can ask me if I want to call on you. I like you all, so I'll probably say yes, but please just wait for us. We're just looking for clarification here. And to the members of the committee, thank you all for being here. We are at a nexus where some of the bills are ones where there are clearly several viewpoints on the bills and we need to hear them. Certainly, these are not, I've asked a lot of questions and I feel a little smarter than I was before, but not a lot. And so we need to come up with something. So the first bill we're going to talk about should be our briefest conversation of the three, and that's House Bill 724. I'm going to characterize it. I'll give the sponsor of the bill a minute to clarify if there's anything I didn't say. And then we'll talk about some of the ideas we've had, but why we can't move on it right now. House Bill 724 was designed to help special ed students to have more continuity if they didn't have much learning this year, that indeed their program would continue for an additional year. Students who would have transitioned out this year and next year. That came through with a fiscal note that totaled over 2 years, nearly $50 million. We weren't quite prepared to spend that amount of money. And so we talked with sponsors and other people, and we talked about some amendments. But before we talk about the amendments, Delegate Guyton, did I have the original intent of the bill correct?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, you do. The idea is truly just to make sure that we're not, after 12 years of paying for schooling and special education for these kids, sort of releasing them out into the world without job qualifications and an ability to support themselves or be independent in any way, which is the goal of education. So I would hope that we could find a solution. It is really complicated, and I'm so thankful to the subcommittee chair for trying to work this bill. I feel like hopefully we're getting closer and that there are other funding opportunities available to us that we might be able to exploit for this. I do want to point out to the subcommittee that if we do not do this through the school system and make it possible for these kids to get the job training that they need, and to clarify, we're not talking about a whole nother year of school. We're just talking about the job training and job coaching that they haven't gotten. Then they are going to be qualified to do that, but they'll have to do it through legal proceedings. So, and it might cost the state, it will cost the state most likely a lot more than what we're looking at here. So with that, I'm just going to let you guys discuss. Thank you so much.
So the thoughts were to make the bill far less expensive by some time, like today. We're not going to take up the amendment because we don't know if it's worth it yet. To reduce the list of students to be those that are transitioning out of vocational programs. And I think there's one other name that is escaping me at this moment. That would be a few additional students. It has been suggested that that represents somewhere in the neighborhood of 700 to 800 students this year who would be transitioning out at the age of 21, and perhaps a similar number next year. So two things we considered was reducing it to that number of students, which would still might represent a sizable fiscal note, but doing it just for this year and then reevaluating for next year. The difficulty we're having is nailing down how many students it is and finding out the cost per student. And so if anybody has any other ideas for the bill, I will take them. But for now, we're waiting for data that's reliable and that that DLS is comfortable with us using in this case. So you can comment on this, or if there's no other commentary, if nobody else has anything else to say, I will move on to the next bill. I'm just giving you sort of a status on that one. All right, seeing nothing. Does anybody know of any of the advocates who would like to say anything about this bill? All right, you're all in your text. You're dying to talk. They can tell you. Okay.
Is that referring to 724 or the next bill?
Yeah, we're still in 724. I pretty much given out. We stand on it. I put it on the agenda in hopes that we would have more information and be able to act on it. We're not there. And so I left it on the agenda, and I thought it was good to tell the subcommittee and the folks who are online where we are and what we're trying to do right now with it.
Yeah, no, thank you. I will leave it up to you. I do know that Andy Colt from the ARC and Leslie Margolis for Maryland Disability Rights are both here and have been working with me on the bill all year. So they may have something they'd like to say, but I'll leave
And
it
they
up
were
to
the
you.
ones in an offline conversation who quoted some of the numbers that we're trying to verify more officially with DLS and some other groups. So I think we'll just leave it at that unless if they're desperate to speak, turn on your camera, and I can, if you have something that in about a minute you can add, that would be wonderful. Going to give it a couple seconds because turn on your camera doesn't always go that fast. All right, they're standing by. Okay, thank you all very much. So that's where we are in 724. Now we come to two bills, one that is a little less complicated in terms of what our options are, and then we'll get to the one that is perhaps a little more confusing all around. We're going to do House Bill 1166, which is a bill that would do three things. One, it would create a more complete reporting of students who are restrained and secluded across the state by not only having the total number, but also the total number of students who were impacted. So we'd be able to see if there are students who are repeatedly being restrained and secluded. That's data that Delegate Wilkins put in a bill last year to gain, which is, I think, incredibly wise because Delegate Wilkins put it in, I think so, but also looking at the bill, I believe it is at the same time. We added some significant things to that this year. They had to do with codifying some of the language that's in COMAR to make it rather permanent about the way we deal with restraint and seclusion in the state. The restraint part was pretty straightforward and pretty close to the same, but on seclusion, this bill goes a good deal farther and actually requires a list of 3 professional people to be at the school to recommend seclusion as a style of helping the student to cope or deal, and also that person has to be present when the seclusion takes place. The issue at hand is that there are schools that feel like this is onerous and they cannot do that because they don't have those professionals available, nor can they afford to have them available. Larger schools can. My talks with people at several schools is that seclusion, while it is not recommended in many situations, occasionally it is indicated. The groups that have the smaller schools would like to expand the list and make it perhaps a little larger. Some of the expansions are quite liberal. Others are just adding a few more professionals. The advocates who brought this bill to me are set that the 3 they have is enough. Now, we can take questions on this. I'm sort of stuck because I don't consider myself enough of an expert to judge those things. And I will talk about what we might do with the bill, but does anybody want to ask any of the advocates questions about this bill or about the intent of this bill? Yes, Delegate Lasanti, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And for the layman education policy person, in English, can you explain to me just kind of dumb down the intent of this bill and what the purpose of this bill and why we need this bill? I'm really not. This is a deep dive in education policy for me. So
yeah, it has been even for me because I'm a general educator. I always say how I've been a teacher, but not. We're talking about generally here schools that usually are non-publics that handle students that are beyond the public school scope to manage. Kennedy Krieger, Linwood, these are schools around the state, Phillips School. Okay. And so I believe the original intent of the bill was to significantly reduce the use of seclusion or make it significantly more carefully done in this case, because I believe the advocates felt that it was being used and perhaps not in the best possible way. As I say, there are schools that say there's a place for it. Some people feel outright, if you heard the testimony, Delegate Lukey actually posited in his question that there's a day coming when restraint and seclusion, or at least seclusion, will be a thing of the past, much in the way that corporal punishment is in schools now. You know, we don't paddle kids anymore. So it's felt that might be a direction this bill is going. It didn't go all the way, but in some people's opinion, it went too far too quickly here. It would be too difficult. And in talking to some professionals who work at these schools, and I'm not going to name names because some of them actually have to be off record when they spoke to me, but
Of course.
there's a place for seclusion. There is a place for it. Occasionally it's indicated. So that's where we're kind of stuck right now.
And so,
Pretty strong opinions.
okay, so seclusion, as far as this bill is concerned, means, I'm looking for the definition.
Well, okay, I think I can do this too. Unfortunately, I look like an expert just because I've been on the phone a lot. And if anybody needs to correct me on this, I'll take it. There are really three things. There's exclusion and seclusion. This bill does not deal with exclusion. Exclusion is mostly when you send a kid out of a situation, you send them to the classroom next door, or you send them into the hallway. It's a place where they are not held against their will. Granted, they shouldn't leave, but they can if they need to. If I send them out the hallway and they just got to go, then they can go. Nobody's going to stop them. Restraint is obviously just that, where we hold a kid against their will. And then seclusion is actually putting them in a room that is locked from the outside so they cannot leave. It's a holding situation in that case. So seclusion is the one that is kind of the one that's at odds in this bill. Does anybody, do any of the advocates want to clarify better what I just said? Being a layman, I got Guy Stevens. Guy, do you want to talk?
Yeah, absolutely. If I could.
Try not to go too long. Give us about a minute or two on this.
Okay, sounds good. So you asked for clarification, and I'll approach that from the perspective of a father, because that's how I got involved in this work. Restraint and seclusion are intended as crisis management interventions, only to be used in situations that involve, by our law, imminent serious physical harm. That's a life or death situation. What we find, however, is in reality, these things are often used for far lesser things. They're used for non-compliance, disrespect, bad language, and the impact of restraint and seclusion is significant. When you ask what seclusion is, it's putting a child in a room against their will and refusing them the ability to leave. Think of it in terms of solitary confinement. You're putting a child, there's nothing regulating about being thrown in a room against your will. People will often tell you kids need to go in there to regulate or cool down. There's nothing about that helps a child to cool down. These are outdated practices that really should be reduced significantly and eliminated, which is really what the goal of this is. So I just wanted to add that. But, I can tell you as a father who had an autistic child that was restrained and secluded, the trauma is significant. My son spent the better part of a year in home and hospital after he was traumatized by restraint and seclusion.
Okay, thank you. Alistair, do you have you want to talk about law a little more on that for a second? Is that correct?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit to that. Under statute, we define these terms, but we require some reporting requirements, but that's largely the extent of it. Under the regulations that have been adopted, there's a lot more restriction on what can happen explicitly. And while in general, these things can only happen when there's a determination of imminent serious physical harm, sometimes under the current regulations, restraint or seclusion can be, once that's been established, added to a behavioral intervention plan or an IEP plan of the student, which can be controversial to be used in the future. So I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Does anybody else in the committee have any clarifications they need, or any concerns or any questions they want to ask about how we've gotten to where we are in the bill right now? All right, that's good. So here are our options at this point. We could make a decision. We could say the three professionals that are indicated in the bill, that's enough, and we could pass it like that. We could add some professionals. I want to say that's going both directions. I've had one person suggest that we just add administrators, which to me is not a good idea. Administrators, I'm not sure they're trained. So it was suggested if we didn't add them, that couldn't be done in regular public schools, to which I said, I think that's good. I don't think there's any situation where a regular public school needs to seclude a child. So so we have extremes here, and I would encourage the advocates to reach out to some of the people on the committee to let them know how you feel. If you committee members, it's up to you if you want to give your very valuable bandwidth to talk to them. The other thing we could do to this bill, because I want to point out that this issue is not a new one. This bill, there have been bills like this for over 10 years in the legislature. And they have often run into the very kinds of problems that we are addressing right here today. And so we could, because we're new to this and because we're figuring it out and because we're not sure we're expert, just as Delegate Lasanti said, and I think that applies to many of us here, although some of us are a little better at this than others, we could simply say, look, we're going to strike that part. We're going to leave the reporting in, which is really valuable. And then I don't want to call it a summer study because then Jay Walker starts to sing. But in fact, I think it would be helpful for us to meet with each other a little bit during the interim and maybe go and visit some of the schools at hand. Maybe we each pick one out in our district. You know, Phillips School is pretty close to me, and Linwood's in Howard County. Kennedy Krieger is here and there. So maybe I would go with some of you to go visit these schools and get a better sense of what we're talking about here. Take a look at the seclusion rooms that they have. Look at the students. Maybe if it's not an intrusion, meet or talk to briefly. At least get to see a student that might be a candidate, so we get a sense of what we're up against. I think I need to do that because I was a general educator in a regular public school, and I'm not sure that I have a grasp of exactly what we're talking about. So we could do that, or like I said, we could get enough information that we feel comfortable going forward. So unless somebody else has a comment, if I feel, I will talk to you all here and there offline and find out kind of where we stand. And if I feel like we have some kind of consensus, we'll come back together and vote on this bill. Okay. If I feel like we're just all kind of up in the air, we'll probably bring it back and reduce it to the reporting element. Yes, Delegate Wilkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks so much for your thoughtfulness and leadership and consensus approach
Keep going with that a little bit
on this
more.
bill. I can go on with the adjectives.
All right.
I just want to consider for everyone. I do think there are certainly a couple of sticking points that we're trying to figure out, and the one we just talked about being the main one. I do feel like these are things that we can work out in order to move this bill forward. This is the second or third time that has been introduced. It has had wonderful previous sponsors, and I'm just also concerned that in this COVID time that we're in, I have two concerns about holding the bill. One being our ability to actually visit schools might be a challenge, maybe later on in the year, but just given where we are, it could potentially be a challenge. I also think that when students return, schools are going to be facing a whole lot when students go back into the classroom. I think that this is the time we need this bill to ensure that there's not a reliance on restraint and seclusion for kids who might be coming to the building and are struggling. So I hear you. Let's talk offline and see if we want to move forward. But just speaking for myself, I hope we can figure these things out and move the bill forward.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to say the advocates, I see we have a comment in the chat. If you want to ask to speak in the chat, please, but let's not get a conversation going in the chat if it's okay with you. Delegate Guyton, and then we do have an advocate who would like to say a few words.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Delegate Wilkins, as well. I agree with you. I think that this is a real problem. We need to find a way to deal with it. I'm going to go with the will of the subcommittee if you decide to take this to a summer study, but I really would prefer to see some movement on this and make sure that there's a real will to push this forward if we do go to a study.
Please don't use the term summer study. Please don't use the term summer study.
To an interim work group situation where we all work.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm so sorry. But it is a problem that needs to be fixed. And if we can't come up with a solution within the next week that we have before crossover, then I do hope that we can really push it strongly after that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And Leslie Margolis, I'd be happy to let you speak and try to keep it to minute and a half, 2 minutes, if you would, please.
Thank you. So I do want to note first that restraint and seclusion are used in public schools quite frequently, as well as in non-public schools, and that seclusion is not just locked door space, but any space from which a student cannot leave voluntarily. And it could be a closet, it could be a room, it could be anything. It could be people holding the door shut, locking it, putting up bolsters or barricades, any space from which the child's not able to leave. I will note that when the bill came through in 2017, from which a lot of this language was drawn, We included a video which was shown to the Ways and Means Committee and to EHE in the Senate of a client of mine who was dragged down the hallway because seclusion usually involves restraint as well, because you have to move the child, and then forced into a seclusion room. And I would be happy to share that video again. It gives a pretty good picture of what that seclusion room looked like. And when the door was open, my client was huddled in a pool of blood. And nobody could explain how he was injured. Seclusion is potentially, as is restraint, potentially life-threatening. There have been deaths in seclusion. There have been deaths in restraint. So from the perspective of those of us who are advocates and those who are parents, waiting and taking time to study this is, potentially time where students can be injured, they could die, and they can be traumatized. And we also share the concern that as students return, there will be more use of these interventions. To specifically address the issue of why psychologists, social workers, clinical licensed social workers, and clinical psychologists and physicians were listed in the bill, and why we're concerned from the advocacy perspective about expanding that. When we look at the numbers of students who are secluded and the number of seclusion incidents that occur, many of those incidents involve current staff people. They include behavior analysts, they include counselors, they include school staff. So this is a very clear attempt to limit the use of seclusion and to limit who can be involved in that.
We do appreciate your comments. Ms. Margolis, you're sort of repeating some of the testimony at the hearing.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I
appreciate your commentary about it, because that's new news about that we should move and the danger there.
Okay. And so
I would summarize for us.
We're happy to talk to anybody and provide additional information about why that is. And there are districts that have and states that have eliminated seclusion, so they can be a guide for us. So thank you.
Delegate, your hand's still up. Did you just not lower it, or do you have something to say? Okay, I see Guy Stevens, but we've already had him speak once, and I think the subcommittee sees the conundrum we're in here. I think there's not too many people who disagree that this needs to be something that's limited, but figuring out how we do. I think that you understand the options. We can sort of take a minute and think, but Delegate Wilkins thinks there's no time for that, and Delegate Guyton thinks that this is not a time for that. So if we can also work on perhaps a compromise, or just saying they're right and we're going ahead. So and by the way, so I think we'll stop discussion on that one. It's very likely it'll be early next week when we have a meeting, and we only probably have one further bill to discuss, and we'll talk about that at the end of this. By the way, Sean and Alistair, Delegate Hartman's trying to get in here. He says I think he's got the 1 o'clock Zoom instead. When we move from 1 to 12 to 1, I think he's got the wrong one. So if you guys can help him locate the correct Zoom to come in here. The good news is we're not voting on anything. So while his rich discussion with us will be missed, we'll certainly fill him in. Okay, last bill, and we're looking about 15 minutes to talk this over a little bit. This is a little confusing, but we've also got a bill here where there are people and I want to say, when we say people on both sides, the nice thing about this committee is usually people who are on two different sides of an issue are really both on good sides of an issue. They're attempting to do something that is really positive, but they have different goals toward it. We do have I think I saw her, she didn't disappear, did she? I think we have the sponsor online here. Is she still on? Can you tell me? I don't see her name.
Oh, I'm here.
There you are. You have your picture up. I was looking for your name. So
sorry.
Without too much discussion, because we did hear this bill already, but if you want to just talk about basically what you think it'll do and what your motivation is for bringing it to us, I'd appreciate that for a minute.
Sure, very briefly. Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Subcommittee Chair, to be before the subcommittee. So as we know, MSDE has childcare articles that I think people on both sides, to the subcommittee chair's point, think could be probably overhauled. But this bill doesn't seek to create a massive overhaul of those regs, but to really fine tune for youth development organizations and programs, those programs that are very distinct from traditional childcare centers that in many ways are designed to take care of our youngest children. And I think that this is a situation of where there's a misalignment between the existing regulations and the services being rendered by youth development organizations and programs versus a traditional childcare center. And this bill just seeks to kind of decouple these youth development organizations and programs, define them more clearly as separate and distinct from childcare centers that are focused on our youngest children, and to ensure that they do not have to engage in rather not only onerous, but sometimes inappropriate regulations that do not even, fit the children and the age of the children that they're servicing. So as a parent of a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old, they're not, for me, usually needing the same things from a youth development organization or a childcare center. So that was the genesis, if that's helpful.
Thank you. Now, and there are some concerns about this bill, and some of you have expressed them to me. Does anybody who's on the subcommittee want to talk about what their concerns are at this time? Okay.
I did, yes. I had my hand up, but you might not be.
I didn't see it. I was a little surprised because I mentioned it. I was like, okay, if she doesn't want to do it, she doesn't want to do it.
Yeah, yes. And thank you so much, Mr.
In those backgrounds, if you raise your hand forward, it doesn't pick you up sometimes.
Right, exactly. Okay.
All right, you got to hold it
I'll
back.
do that. I'll do this next time.
Right, that kind of thing.
And thank you so much, Delegate Smith, for bringing this bill. I think that goal is absolutely right, and I'm on board with that. I want to start with a question. I'm trying to, only thing that I can't, I'm not quite understanding from testimony and the written, listening to the testimony is these entities that are included, and it is very broad in terms of the groups that are included in the bill language. And I definitely recommend that committee members take a look at that. You all were going along well, you're doing good work in the community, and you seem to have hit some kind of bump in the road. What are the additional actions or duties or expansion of your work that is taking place that is hitting you up against MSDE? Because I'm understanding that you all have been doing this work, you do great work in the community, and now either it's an expansion of your work, something related to COVID-19, and suddenly you are hitting this bump, and I just have not been able to fully understand that piece of it. And then I do have concerns, but I want to make sure I understand this part first.
And I see Moira Cyphers here who is representing them. I don't know, Moira, if there's any, I'm having trouble remembering all the names. I'm not sure there's anybody in particular, but Moira, if you'd like to try to answer Delegate Wilkins' question, I appreciate that.
Sure, and I saw the bill sponsor nodding her head too. The primary change for some of these groups is a change in hours. So they opened for Zoom school to provide a place for kids to go and have reliable access to internet and for parents to be able to go to work. And that's it. That's the only thing that's different. And one of the, I represent the Boys and Girls Clubs, and one of the clubs who got a cease and desist from MSDE hadn't even started. So they were just advertising and had enrolled, I think, 6 kids, and MSDE sent a cease and desist even prior to them starting. So it's, we've operated under a tenuous exemption that I think, unfortunately, the pandemic has just highlighted that it's not, we don't have good, appropriate licensing and regs for school-age kids. It's all, and pretty much rightly so, geared towards early childhood, keeping those kids safe and all cared for. And I'm a mom of young kids too, so I'm very sensitive to these issues.
So that said, you can see, and the child cares feel like they have a lot of regs to do, and they're feeling like these groups wouldn't, and gives them an unfair advantage, and maybe even hurts their business models, I think. And I don't think they would say that, but I'll say it. And so 2 things that I have had suggested and have suggested is that one of my concerns when we met during interim about childcare was that with school-age childcare suddenly becoming necessary, that there would be a greater need, which many of the childcare said they could fulfill. There was capacity and they were working toward that. But also in certain neighborhoods, it may not be available. And I think the feeling is that some of these groups like YMCAs, boys clubs and girl clubs are situated in neighborhoods where they're perhaps a little more accessible. And so the two things I'd like to do, and I'd like to talk, and again, this is up to committee members too in this case. The suggestion is that even if we do go forward with this idea, that we don't remove, give a complete absolution from regs, but we pick out which regs should remain based on safety, because that was an issue I heard brought up at the hearing, that it's an issue of safety. But, and I hate to use the example, but there are some things that if we limit them to perhaps school-age children, and maybe limit them to a situation similar to what exists here, where parents are still working, but kids are not leaving for school each day, but staying home, that they deal with school-age children, and that some of the regs that deal with smaller children not apply, and the little toilets. I think we used it as an example in the hearing, but it's a real thing, but perhaps they wouldn't. So we could identify which particular regs that exist that they could be absolved from. And another possibility would to say that this is in an extraordinary situation similar to what exists here. Alistair and I have come up with language with this for this over and over again, in which students are not going to the school building, but instruction is continuing. Because one of my really large concerns during the summer was that there would be even legally 8, 9, 10-year-olds that would be left home to do their schooling while their parents had to go to work. And probably 5, 6, and 7-year-olds who actually legally can't be left home. But what sort of monitoring or reporting would there be on that? And do we really want to do that? Do we really want to imperil those families with citations and things? So we were looking for solutions, and I'd be curious if anyone wants to comment that this might be a solution in an extraordinary circumstance like I described, and perhaps instead of, as I say, just crossing off the regulations, rather we would take a look at which regs we would allow to be crossed off in this situation, and which ones we would we leave the rest in place. Delegate Lasanti, I rambled a bit there, so weigh in, stop me. I see your hand up, Delegate Lasanti. Did you want to say something? Just forgot to take it down. Okay. It's universal, I guess.
Sorry, I was flipping back to the language of the bill. I apologize, and I apologize. No, I really do like this bill, and I think it's very necessary, because I know that particularly the Boys and Girls Club in my county, we had to work with them very closely to try to during COVID, to try to get them to be able to do some wraparound services that because of their of the way they were classified, that were not meeting MSDE requirements. So I do think this bill is appropriate. But one thing I wanted to just point out, and I was wondering if the sponsor would look at this possibly as a friendly amendment. It's the programs of recreation and parks in county or municipal corporations. I think that's extremely, so some jurisdictions, those kind of programs aren't always operated through parks and recreations. They're called different things in different municipal governments and different county governments. So I wondered if it could just be something that is sponsored by a county or municipal government.
And before we get an answer on that, so you put a pin in that. Delegate Wilkins wasn't quite done. I know she asked a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. You called on me.
No, that was my fault. My fault.
Oh, I apologize.
I wasn't following. No, blame me. Go ahead.
Okay, I was reading, so I wasn't watching
everything. So do it here. Delegate Wilkins, did you have something else you want to say? It might actually help with the conversation
Yeah. So building off of what Delegate Ebersole shared, I think that the goals of this bill are good. I just think it needs to be reined in a whole lot. I think that going from after school childcare to youth programming into full day is directly getting to a point where you are and you're taking care of children while parents are at home, even though you're doing interactive programming and things like that, and maybe at a different or higher level, but you're kind of getting into a potential child care space. I think that if we look
Lori,
at this,
can
in
I have the bill
context-
file for 717?
Delegate Guyton, can you mute yourself, please? Thank you.
I am so sorry.
I think that some things that I would like to see is that we do limit this. Maybe we try this out for a year and see how it goes during the emergency. I'm extremely concerned about competing with childcare providers who are struggling, who are not seeing their kids return. And then we open up these very large organizations to directly compete with them. Family childcare providers are in the neighborhoods and are, in terms of, we're talking about proximity, a lot of times parents send their children to family childcare because those providers are more so in the neighborhood. And I'm concerned that in this bill, it's just reporting. We're just assuming in terms of accountability, in terms of oversight, it's basically a reporting bill where these organizations get to say, oh, you know, we're doing the background checks and we're doing, you know, whatever the provisions are, whereas we're just kind of relying on them to get report on the back end as opposed to any type of oversight. So I would like us to take a more narrowed in approach where there are absolutely regulations that don't make sense for these groups. Let's focus in on those. Let's exempt them from those regulations. Let's make this a shorter time period and also make sure that we're not directly competing with and hurting our childcare providers.
Okay, and so we're at 12:56. And we don't want to run into Ed Sub here because it's so important. So I see, I'm going to close with, you understand where we stand a little bit. Again, advocates, please reach out to members of the subcommittee. We may bring this bill back for consideration, but it looks like it's going to take some hard work and some detailed work if we're going to do some of the things that people have said. And I will tell you candidly, I tend to see it that way, that we can't do a full strike here of regulations. We have to be in line a little bit. And so, you have Delegate Wilkins, who she doesn't have that much to do these days. So, get a hold of her. She's not too busy and you can do that. So Delegate Smith, I'm going to give you, we're at 56, I'll give you 2 or 3 minutes. If you have questions you want to answer, or last thing that you want to do.
Oh, I don't need a whole 2 or 3 minutes because I'm on the very important education subcommittee. So
aren't we all?
But I just want to say, thank you to everyone for the suggestions. A lot of it made a lot of sense. But I do want to, as a point of clarification, say, I don't believe that the youth development organizations that we're talking about in programs are in any direct competition with childcare centers. They weren't prior to the pandemic, nor are they now, because they service completely different age groups. So in many ways, I have a lot of sympathy for the undersubscribed childcare centers, but it shouldn't become now my big kid needs to help fulfill the unfortunate undersubscription of your childcare center, because my 6-year-old, my 8-year-old, if I had an older kid, they don't want to be where a 2-year-old is. So I think these are apples and oranges conversations, and I am very, very open and receptive to targeting the exemptions under the childcare statute that don't really seem consistent with a youth development organization or program. And I think that would be something that we could probably work together on very easily, and also the tightening of language that Delegate Lasanti offered, again, accounting for the different frames and labels, that are used in jurisdictions. That is definitely also well taken. So I want to cede my remaining time to Maura, because I believe.
So what we're gonna do here is I'm gonna point out that you see Ellie Mitchell's picture up and you see Clint McSherry's picture up, and these are people who represent the two organizations here that are mostly we're concerned about, and that as you say, some would say they're competing and some would say they're not. These are both good people, okay? These are both good organizations. So we're up against it here. And that's why I decided to have a meeting where we talked instead of voted. I think Delegate Smith, it falls to you to try to interface with Delegate Wilkins and me and some other folks, if you want to see if we can come up with something that is palatable, doesn't hurt, indeed doesn't or stops hurting or doesn't hurt childcare and their business, and at the same time rescues some kids that might not otherwise have care in a very safe and thoughtful way. So let's, we have a couple days, we'll probably have an early childhood meeting on Tuesday. I will point out to you that if you're looking at bills, there's one last bill, which is Delegate Solomon's House Bill 944, which is a child care kind of seed program bill. At first, I thought that there was, I could not isolate the money for that, but I'm getting a mixed signal from leadership on that. So it's possible that we will bring that bill. It's not very complicated, but if you want to take a look at that, that might be one of the last bills that we deal with before the Senate bills come over. So take a look at these. 724, if information comes in, 1166, I think is probably our hardest decision in some ways. 1307, we need to find some kind of common ground here. So with that, it's 1 o'clock, and I'm sure that Delegate Washington is impatiently tapping his foot for 3 members of his education subcommittee to show up. So I'm going to call